What's up guys, in this video we're going to talk about exposure. Now exposure is going to be the lightness and darkness of your photo, and it is determined by three settings on your camera: your ISO, your shutter speed, and your aperture. Now when you're shooting in RAW and editing in post, you can do a lot and there's a lot of leeway, but our goal is to always get the correct exposure because it makes the editing and post-processing a whole lot easier. Alright, so we're going to talk about all of these things, but to start off, let's go over shutter speed. Shutter speed is going to be the length of time that your digital sensor is exposed to light. Shutter speed is measured in seconds, and typically when looking at your camera, you're going to see 1 over another number, and this is going to be how quick your image is exposed. So with a higher shutter speed, like 1 over 4,000, the less motion blur you're going to see. So you're pretty much going to freeze everything in your frame. That way there's nothing happening. Nothing is soft, everything is crisp and sharp that you want to have in focus. Now, if you go 1 over 8 or something like that, you're gonna introduce more motion blur, not only from the subject that you're shooting, but also yourself, because regardless of how still you think you are, you're still introducing a bit of motion in your camera. Alright, so next we're going to talk about aperture, which is also referred to as your f-stop. So when you look at your camera, you're going to see something that says f2.8 or f16. That is going to be your aperture. And your aperture is going to be how much light is allowed in to your camera to expose your image. So the lower the number, the more light that's going to be allowed into your camera. So for example, f1.4 is going to let a lot more light in than f22. Your aperture also plays a factor in the depth of field. The depth of field is going to be the blurriness or sharpness of the background that you're shooting. All right, and last but not least is ISO. Your ISO is going to be the amount of sensitivity that your sensor has. So typically in low light scenarios, you have to crank your ISO up pretty high, but with cranking your ISO up, you're introducing digital grain into your image. So the higher the ISO, the more grain you're going to get and the brighter your image is going to be. But the lower the ISO, the less grain you're going to get, or no grain, and the darker your image is going to be. So these three things, shutter, aperture, and ISO, all work together and depend on one another to determine how well exposed your image is. So typically when you change one, you may have to change the other to make sure your image is properly exposed.